In a quiet American town where time seemed to slow down and the world felt just a little bit kinder, there was a 96-year-old man named Frank. Frank was a war veteran who had seen it all, both the horrors of battle and the sweetness of peace. He lived alone in a modest home that was filled with memories, a home that seemed to hold more history than the town itself. His only company on most days was his old dog Duke, a loyal companion who'd been with him for over a decade. Despite his age, Frank still went out for walks in the morning, visiting the small park just down the road. It wasn't much, but it was his routine. One sunny afternoon, as Frank made his usual way to the park, something happened that would forever change his view on humanity. 5 bikers, young men with rough expressions and louder personalities, pulled into the parking lot next to the park. Their motorcycles roared like thunder as they made their entrance, the sound cutting through the usual calm. At first, Frank didn't think much of it. He had seen his fair share of strangers over the years, and they never seemed to pay him any mind. But this time, something was different. The bikers seemed to be more interested in him than in anything else. They looked at him with sneers, murmuring amongst themselves in ways that made Frank feel uneasy. Frank kept walking, minding his own business. He had seen enough to know when it was better to ignore people, especially when they seemed to be spoiling for a fight. But as he passed the group, one of the bikers taller than the rest, with tattoos covering both arms, suddenly blocked his path. The man smirked and said, Well, what do we have here? An old man out for a stroll?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath and gave the biker a steady look. "Just passing through," Frank said, his voice calm but firm. He had dealt with much worse in his time. The biker didn't like the response. He stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "You think you're special, huh?" He jeered. "What, you some kind of hero or something?" The group laughed, a few of them giving each other high fives. The tension in the air was thick. Frank's heart began to beat a little faster, but he wasn't afraid. He had been through wars, both literal and metaphorical. He knew when to stand his ground. One of the other bikers, a younger man with a leather jacket adorned with chains, stepped forward. "Hey, old man, we're talking to you. Don't ignore us." But Frank remained silent, his eyes scanning the group. He could feel their hostility, but he also sensed something else, a bit of nervousness hidden beneath their tough exteriors. It was clear that they weren't used to being challenged by someone who wasn't scared of them. After a long moment of silence, Frank did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. The bikers watched him closely, unsure of what he was doing. Frank slowly raised the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving the group. The leader of the bikers stepped back, his arrogance faltering just slightly. "Who are you calling, old man?" he demanded, his voice shaking just a little now. Frank didn't answer. Instead, he waited for the phone to ring, then spoke into it. "Hello, yes, this is Frank. I'm at the park, and I've got a situation here. I think it might be time for some backup." There was a long pause before a voice on the other end responded, low and steady. Frank nodded, his expression unchanged. "I'll wait right here," he said. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't know who Frank was calling, but something about the situation felt off. They had been used to bullying people and intimidating anyone who wasn't tough enough to stand up for themselves. But this old man? There was something different about him, something they couldn't quite place. The minutes dragged on, the bikers growing more and more uncomfortable. One by one, they shifted uneasily on their feet. The leader of the group fidgeted with his jacket, then looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to show up at any moment. The tension in the air was palpable. Suddenly, Frank ended the call and looked at them. "You'd better go," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. It's going to get a lot more crowded here real soon." At that moment, the bikers, once so full of bravado, seemed to shrink. Their faces turned pale, and the leader, swallowing hard, took a few steps back. The group didn't say a word. Without another glance at Frank, they quickly hopped onto their bikes and revved the engines, speeding off in the direction they had come from. Frank stood there, watching them go, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or throw a punch. He had simply reminded them that there were forces in the world far bigger than their egos. And in that moment, Frank knew he had won not by fighting, but by staying calm and showing that strength isn't always about how loud you can be. Sometimes, it's about how quiet you can be and still command respect. As he turned to walk home, Frank smiled to himself. He had lived through wars, through loss, and through so many battles, both external and within. But today, he had fought a different kind of battle, one that reminded him of the power of his own resilience, the importance of standing tall in the face of fear, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come without a single punch being thrown.